All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for hanging in this late in the afternoon. And I'm going to give an overview of what's going on in the United States with climate change integration into our federal environmental impact assessment law, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard of, if not work with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. I'm not going to go over the details of the act. I think many of you know it was the first environmental impact assessment law in the world. And while we may have been first in getting at that law, as I'll explain to you as we go through what's sort of currently going on, I don't think we're first out of the gate in formal regulations on climate change yet, but there is some work being done, as we'll talk about. But law obviously set out a process very similar to the ones that probably many of you work at in different countries, but also I would imagine, like most of your statutes, doesn't certainly say anything, this one from the year 1969, specific to climate change. But one of the big debates going on in our country here is whether the statute or the regulations certainly need to change in order to cover this issue, or whether it's just sort of inherent in the general language that the Act talks about for studying impacts on, as this law describes it, broadly, the human environment. So we have a regulatory structure, again, some of you are familiar with, but if you're not, where we have the statute itself, which is by the standards of American environmental law, is very short, very succinct, about 6 pages long, pretty simplistic, and then that led then to a set of much more detailed instructions that the White House Council on Environmental Quality, also widely known as CEQ here in the U.S., created to give federal agencies step-by-step instructions on how to do the analyses. And those were codified pretty much in their current form in the presidency of Jimmy Carter back in 1969. There was one minor change that Michael actually referred to this morning regarding worst-case analysis back in 1986, but that's the only change ever. So they've been kind of frozen in stone, and so they also include absolutely no specific mention of climate change in them. The law also required individual federal agencies to create their own regulations for their own agency for implementing NEPA. I haven't heard of any of those that have directly incorporated climate change or requirements to analyze climate change yet, but I imagine we could see some at some point. And then, as Michael talked about this morning, and I'll talk a little bit about today, there's quite a bit of case law activity on this issue, especially just in the last couple of years. And the way our law works, partly because the statute and the regulations have been revised so little, that case law serves an important sort of updating, and certainly I'm sure already has on this issue, as I'll show you a few examples, and will going forward. And then I have a dashed line there, and it says other guidance documents, and both the White House CEQ and agencies themselves periodically issue guidance documents that don't carry the force of law, and that'll be important when we talk about specifically with CEQ on this issue here in the United States. So this is still a relatively new issue for analyses under NEPA. It's really just gotten a lot of attention in the past couple years. You could probably go back 10 or 20 years. I've heard representatives from the Department of Energy talk about covering climate change in EISs 20 years ago, but that was very, very rare. So it is still new. I will tell you there's quite a bit of resistance still among a lot of agencies, both sort of in their management as well as ground level impact assessment staff, to doing the analyses. I think it's changing a bit over time, but it's still there as well. Now, I mentioned there wasn't really any specific mention of climate change in the implementing regulations for the law. However, there is this section, particularly it's 2 sections in the regulations, 1502, 16, E and F, but especially letter E, that actually requires agencies to discuss energy requirements and conservation potential of various alternatives and mitigation measures. And as you heard this morning, and many of you know, obviously, greenhouse gas emissions especially, and energy use go hand in hand pretty well. This has been, just so you know, a pretty widely ignored section and essentially a requirement of the NEPA regulations. And I suspect as we see more litigation challenges go forward, this will probably be an area that folks will use as they make their challenges. We also have a section that, again, doesn't mention climate change specifically, but probably like a lot of other country laws that you're involved with, we have a requirement to do cumulative impact assessment. This is where a lot of the attention for climate change is focused in the U.S., particularly that last part, and this becomes a crucial issue in the debate over whether to analyze greenhouse gas emissions under our law and to talk about their effects and whether they're significant, which is a key term in our law. So I'll come back and talk about that in a little bit. Now, I mentioned this is a new issue for this particular law in the United States, but it has been changing rather rapidly. I won't go through all of these factors, and many of them you're very familiar with as well. Again, I'll come back and talk about the litigation in a minute. There have been things going on with some of the other laws, like the Endangered Species Act and several high-profile species, including the polar bear being listed in recent years. And obviously, we have still a relatively new administration, although it's been 2 years now, but certainly that's been a big change in terms of the focus of this particular issue. Even as you heard this morning, the congressional action has been somewhat slow from a policy standpoint, but a lot of things going on at other levels. So really quickly with litigation, one thing I don't think Michael showed you this morning is a wonderful website resource. I think he mentioned it, that the Columbia Climate Law Center keeps up, and you can see the website there. I would urge all of you to use this. It covers a wide aspect or variety of climate change law areas, but probably the ones most interest to most of you will be the ones relating to impact assessment in the center of the chart, and all of this is hot linked. So I'll just show you what the tab for NEPA, there's a similar one for state impact assessment laws as well. And this tree shows, I think, Michael, you mentioned this morning about 40 cases. What's interesting is if you look about the center of the second column, that's where 2009 starts and then continues down. So fully more than half of these cases have come just in the past year or so. So a rapid increase we're seeing in activity as well. And as Michael mentioned, what's no super solid threads from all of this coming out yet, other than if an agency has been completely silent in not addressing the issue at all. Several of the courts have found that to be a violation and have ordered revisions in impact analyses. But if analyses are then done, or if they're done originally, the courts have not been real picky yet in sort of tearing apart those analyses or asking for specific things. So we'll see if that changes going forward. Probably the most famous NEPA climate change case was from a few years ago, 2007. Everybody calls it the CBD case for the main NGO that filed the suit along with others, the Center for Biological Diversity. This involved fuel economy standards for the light truck segment of vehicles sold in the United States. The agency actually did do, back in 2005, when they did this assessment, an assessment of the greenhouse gas emissions from the vehicles, which was relatively rare back then, but they just stopped there. And the court was very clear in throwing out that analysis that they felt that more needed to be done. And one of the things they said was just reporting the greenhouse gas emissions was not the actual environmental consequences of the action, and they were one step along the way. And so they wanted discussion of what happens when the greenhouse gas emissions go up in the air. They also very much stress that this is an issue that falls under the purview of NEPA and impact analysis in the U.S., and use very strong language to say that it was indeed sort of the ultimate cumulative impact to cover. This led to a series of EISs that I'll mention to you at the end of my presentation. Michael also mentioned this morning a very important case. It's not a NEPA case, but it certainly has had ramifications, I think, for NEPA and other laws relating to climate change, and that was the Clean Air Act case, a Supreme Court decision. And this, I think, for a lot of the courts and others and agencies, is sort of helps bolster the sort of argument that the issue needs to be covered. Now, almost all of the climate change litigation to date in the U.S. involving NEPA has dealt with the top of this graphic, the greenhouse gas emissions from projects and thus their impacts on climate change. But I think over time, and Michael mentioned this as well this morning, I think the bottom part, the impacts of climate change both onto a project and onto the resources that a project affects is going to be a far bigger issue. And I think we'll see probably litigation on this issue pretty quickly. And we have actually in some other laws, I just show this as an example of an Endangered Species Act case where the agency did an analysis looking at essentially water management in the Central Valley in California and its effect on a listed species of fish, and basically said that the water environment in that region coming out of Sierra snowpack and other resources would essentially be the same in 30 years as it is today. And the court just said, look, here's 1,000 pages of state and federal and academic studies that say that's not true, so therefore, you were incorrect in making that assumption.